Hello, everyone. Great to be back again. A little bit of housekeeping before I start. So, my recent article on India's free speech and First Amendment is out on Quillette. Link is in the description below. Please check it out, read it. Let me know your thoughts, criticism, praise, comments, anything. That out of the way. I'm honored to be talking today with Professor Amit Chaudhuri, who is a novelist, a literary critic, musician, professor with multiple accolades, including the Sahitya Akademi Award, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and has also been in the jury of the Man Booker Prize. We'll be talking today with his relatively recent book, Finding the Raga, which is on Indian classical music. It's a brilliant book. Professor Chaudhary, great to have you.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
So I wanted to start by talking about the act of listening, which you describe in the book in early pages. Uh, because what struck me about that is the description of your first encounter with Indian classical music. And I found that that description is somewhat archetypal because almost every listener of Indian classical music goes through that phase where upon the first lesson, the music is immediately subject to parody, which is not the case with, let's say, folk or ghazals or even jazz. People might not like it at first listen and they may consider it too slow or too morose or too abstract, but it's not immediately subject to parody. So why do you think that is?
Because when we listen to, I mean, I don't know how much we overhear Hindustani classical music anymore these days, but I certainly, because I was growing up in the age of the radio, would overhear all kinds of music, you know, which included Hindi film music of the time. So I was born in 1962. So growing up in the 60s and 70s, it was still an age where, to begin with, I mean, India in the 60s didn't have any television at all. And then television made an entry, I think, sometime in the early 70s, but nobody really watched it. It was mainly agricultural programs. So, radio was still a dominant form of public dissemination, and I would overhear music, and we would all be overhearing the graded classical singers on All India Radio who would be singing Khayal. Basically, I mean, by then, by the 20th century, Khayal had become the dominant form, and it would sound, the Tan sections would sound like strange and funny, and the alap section, the beginning bits, which then went on to expand into a kind of full-fledged exploration of the rag through a progression, would sound typical in terms of being shapeless, formless, and there seemed to be no, I mean, one didn't think about it in such detail, but words didn't seem to form an important part of this music. Not that words were ever that important to me in music, but it didn't have a song-like structure either. What was being sung, what one sort of understood as song was not what one heard when one was overhearing Hindustani classical music. It didn't sound like a song was being sung. It sounded like a particularly strange approach to notes, with the akar being dominant. It sounded like that. So, to a young person's ear or to a child's ear, it wouldn't have made much sense at all.
But the tans are also present in Qawwali, but I think the sort of fast tempo, I think, makes it more accessible compared to like Hindustani classical music.
That's right. And also the kind of the tans, especially when they start, the gamaks. So this will not make sense. You don't know what's going on over there.
Mm.
The mead is being used to kind of create undulation. So when you're listening to when you're listening to that kind of deep undulation that is being caused by mead and gamak, then which leads to tan, then
Mm.
you kind of are confused. You don't know what's happening.
So since you mentioned Khayal, because I wanted to talk a little bit about Khayal and Drupad, could you like describe what Khayal and Drupad is for our listeners? It's like simple
Well,
terms.
I mean, Drupad predates the Khayal,
Mm-hmm.
and and I suppose for centuries it was the dominant form of vocal music, and vocal music, of course, is at the center of Hindustani classical music. And so one could say that it was a very important form in Hindustani classical music, where consisting of a kind of alap, which is different from khayal, which often proceeds on the akar, or words which don't always retain a clear shape as the rag is being explored. In contrast to that, I think in Drupad, the main form of progression or alap that was done when, in fact, the instruments were silent. The instrument was the pakawaj was silent, and was the nom tom alap based on the syllables nom and tom, and in a way, it's a bit like the alap and jhala section of sitar, playing before the gat begins, before the tabla starts, and a composition is played. So the Nom Tom was increasingly sort of, even though it was in free time, increasingly percussive, you know, uh, in um, in the way it explored the rag through those syllables, nom tom nom tana nana nom tana, that kind of thing.
Tarana.
The raga is being nom tanana nom dana nom 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 tanana nom nom danana. Like that's a quick example of a
Mm.
known kind of form of doing alap. Um, um, then once the pakawaj begins to play and the composition is sung, and it's mainly a composition which has a bhakti component, and then the singer embarks on very meticulous cycles of lekari, or playing around with the time cycle. So if it's a 10 beat time cycle, then it's a sadra, or if it's one of those offshoots of the Drupad form, then the time cycle is being played um, within in terms of the words of the song and a kind of progression of laikari begins to happen. Um, with Khayal, it's quite different, especially Khayal as we know it, which is the kind of Khayal which came into existence after radical innovations began to be made to it in the early 20th century to the mid 20th century. That is, it's a slowed, I mean, the bulk of it, the alap section, is a radically slowed down version of the composition. The composition is set to the rag, then the composition is slowed down, and then the rag in that slowed down time frame and atmosphere is expanded and dwelt upon. A progression happens from the lower sa to the upper sa. So the rag is completed in terms of its exposition, but completed reluctantly almost. It's almost as if this is inherent in the form of thinking and the form of structural thinking that we use the name rag for, that it doesn't move up and down like a scale or a mode or a thought even in a linear fashion, in a simple way from sa to sa, sa re ga ma pa dha ni sa. It will go up and come down, and it'll go up again. It'll omit certain notes on the way up. Certain notes will be sung on the way down or omitted. It's a very specific idea of how you can explore a slowed up or slowed down tune, which is basically what a rag is. It is a slowed down melody in order to explore the significance of notes which are being observed or sung, and notes which are being ignored, or which are being made absent on either in the rag or on the way up or down. And these omissions and these sort of inclusions have a particular kind of significance, and so does the relationship in that rag between one note and another. And it might be a peculiar relationship. For instance, the relationship between pa and coming down to re in Yemen or Chayanat. That particular relationship is or between pa and komal re, or the flat second in Shri. These are definitive relationships which the singer is dwelling on yet again, is pondering and preoccupying themselves with yet again, in a way that they can't if they only sing it as a song or a melody or a composition. It's only as a slowed down melody or a slowed down, radically slowed down song that we begin to notice the significance of these relationships between notes, and the tension that exists between notes which exist in a form of simultaneity, but not the simultaneity of a harmonic chord when they're all played simultaneously, but a simultaneous awareness, so that when you are singing pa in Shri, you are also simultaneously aware of the possibility of re, of going to re, or of going to ma, pa, ma, dha, and then pa and re. So these things are at any point of time simultaneously present in the rag and its possibilities. But as I said, these significances only become available to us because the rag is a slowed down melody, and the what I would call the philosopher musician is then no longer concerned with just the original melody or tune or composition. They are concerned with what emerges when the melody is slowed down. And what the khayal does is it further slows it down. it creates a form in which tal and rag are both being extended to their limits so that they become unrecognizable both as tal and song, as rag. So I mean, this is what happens with the khayal by the 50s or so, but it's already happened with Abdul Wahid Khan. He in the early 20th century slows down the Vilambit khayal, and Amir Khan slows it down further. So a kind of time cycle of 12, like iktal din din dhagatke tunna katta dhagatke dinna, becomes dhin, dhin, dha, ge, ti, ra, ta, ta, tu, na, so etc. So obviously people are puzzled. I mean, the first, as I've said in Finding the Rag, the first people who heard this would have been as puzzled as the people who went to the first exhibitions of Impressionist and post-Impressionist paintings and said that this is not a painting at all. Are these supposed to be human beings? Are these supposed to be figures? And they did say that these the one critic said these are tongues. They don't look like figures. This too doesn't sound like a tal, or doesn't sound like any kind of time signature or beat. A beat should sound like 1 2 3 1 2 3, or 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4. Or if tintal is played faster, na din din na din din na din din na din din na. But once it begins with na, din, din, na, then it breaks it down into something that is testing the limits of recognizability. And this is being done because of the philosophical pursuit of certain musicians to take things away from any kind of representational domain.
Mm.
So a song could be about something, it could be representing something, it could be talking about something, it would be talking about Krishna, or it would be talking about the landscape. But one of the things it represents is itself. A song has, just as a painting, you should be able to recognize it's a painting in the first place. Before even recognizing what's being painted, you should say that, yes, that's a painting. But when a form is stretched to its limit, then you might say, this is not a painting. What is this? It's not a painting. So similarly with Hindustani classical music, because of certain radical innovations, people are saying, what is this? What kind of music is this? And this is because of these radical innovations and this tendency towards testing the limits of the representational. In this case, song representing itself as song, tal representing itself as tal, so that we know this is tal, this is song. Testing that limitations of that and expanding it so that it no longer remains tal in any conventional sense. It no longer remains song in any conventional sense, which makes possible a whole domain of new meaning, of new possibilities, of freedom to explore very nuanced kinds of shifts and relationships between notes.
That description reminds me of a lot of jazz compositions, very specific ones, which well, I'll talk about it when we talk about jazz later on. But this is a point that I think needs emphasis because of just how radical it is, and I want people to realize how radical it is, because if you look at the way in which Indian art and drama and dance has evolved, it is through the Natya Sastras, the uh, sort of story narrative plays a crucial role in it, and feelings plays a crucial role in it. And you find that in perhaps Drupad places a lot more emphasis in words and emotions and feelings, and so does Carnatic classical music, uh, or other forms of music that have since sprung up, Nazrul Giti or Rabindra Sangeet and Odissi and things like that. So the emphasis is heavily on words and what they're trying to convey, so much so that, I learned Odissi for a bit, and I was told to emphasize on those words because the point was to get it across. And so there wasn't as much freedom to play around. You had to be very clear. And maybe a ghazal singer also has to be very clear about the words because of how crucial that is. But the departure from that, from Dhupad to Khayal, is a radical one. So like, do you agree with the discussion that Drupad places a lot more emphasis on words and emotions?
There is a importance there, but at the same time, Nom Tom
Hmm.
shows a kind of willingness to depart from using words for song, for music. In otherwise, I think the one way we think of music is via song, and song is inextricable from words. You know, but once you go into Nom Tom, then you see a tendency in a culture to not just create a separate kind of entity called instrumental music, in which there will be no words, but even to divorce vocal music, which is associated with song, from significant words. Significance then begins to lie elsewhere. If so much of time is being spent on a progression through the syllables nom and tom, but Khayal takes it to takes it further. And in terms of the other genres you mentioned, ghazal, Rabindra Sangeet, Nazrul Giti, mm, whatever, folk songs. Um, yes, I mean the at least the listeners will give a lot of importance to words, and words, the pronunciation of words, the enunciation of words, the how I mean how well they're communicated, how clearly they're communicated, will be a kind of element of how we judge that song. Um, but a kind of a casual bohemian attitude, um, inflects the khayal singers' relationship with words, and this releases a different kind of spiritual significance from bhakti, uh, or even lyric poetry, which say Rabindra Sangeet or ghazal kind of imparts, or contains. Um, so a different register of meaning is being sounded. I'm saying I'm distinguishing it also from the sort of the casual bohemianism of a strand of rock music in the late 60s.
Jimi
Um,
Hendrix.
Jimi Hendrix and others who are also not pronouncing words in a way that makes you think that they necessarily want to be understood. So the bohemianism has either antecedents of a kind of romanticism or modernism as far as people like Hendrix and other his contemporaries are concerned. And what's happening in Khayal has antecedents, a non-representational antecedents that go back to antiquity in Indian culture. Antiquity that is an antiquity lineages that are different from, say, bhakti, you know, or ghazal or folk music, non-representational lineages, which also are becoming very important and are circulating in the West and becoming important to the modernists too. They too are getting exposed to these non-representational traditions right from the end of the 18th century onwards. So what we're looking at is an era of casual bohemianism, which is also spiritually alive to meanings that lie in incompletely or inattentively pronounced words, and which meanings which cannot be suggested or accessed by properly pronounced words or proper enunciation. And they're creating a different space for themselves. Of course, Khayal singers, some of them do pronounce words well, beautifully, like Jasaraj, for instance. And it's wonderful to hear some of those lyrics being sung in a way that one can see how he's kind of showcasing the text. Others don't pronounce words well and are criticized and berated, especially by the lay public, for singing words in a way that maul them and disfigure them. But they seem to have been, and I'm talking about the past now. Now there is no bohemian world anymore in that particular constituency, but it's all become tradition, sacredness, etc. So, those people who are criticized for not pronouncing words that well went on regardless, doing exactly what they were doing. All Khayal singers will anyway find it difficult to attend to the outline and shape of words and pronounce words properly at all times, because they are improvising often on akar or often on the word in a way that stretches it out or cuts it off during the sum. When it comes back to the one of the cycle, even cuts it off and joins it up with the rest of the word later on. So words are always being sort of not disrespected. They're being played around with in a new way. That's why I think these words are important to singers, even to play around with and disfigure. Otherwise, they would all have gone for just nom tom. If they didn't want the words, they want that tension, I think, with words being there and then them disfiguring the words, or disfiguring may not be the right word, but stretching them. Everything else is being stretched to the limit. Song, melody, tal. Let's stretch words to their limit as well, so that they lose their instant recognizability. They don't want to do away with words. Otherwise, they would have gone back to nom tom. But the whole thing about Khayal is how it is using words, but using them in a way that is not associated with the way words exist in a song.
So I'm not sure whether the intention of, let's say, Nom Tom in Drupad or Tarana, for example, whether the intention was to present sort of radical departure or space to play around in the same way as Khayal did. in a very obvious manner, because I don't think Amir Khusro, when he presented Qawwali, the Qawwali singers did not really seem to have faced much criticism or controversy when they sang taranas. It seemed to fit in with the sort of larger song and narrative, and was no different from, let's say, Tan acting as a sort of uh, beat switch, beat change kind of thing. So the intention there seemed to be very different from, let's say, someone like Ustad Amir Khan, who says, who talks about when he doesn't find words that he can just sing telephone numbers and things like that. So there's a vast difference between the two, and I'm not sure whether the intention even in the two is to find the same space.
I mean, with Tarana, it's easier to tolerate the Tarana because it's sung to a brisk kind of
Hmm.
rhythm, tempo. Na din din na din din na. That's the tempo at which you sing Tarana. Especially sometimes you kind of do those kind of improvisations on in Tarana at a very fast tempo. Imitating the jhala in after Gat. But the opening sections of Drupad, Nom, Tom, that's certainly peculiar. I can't imagine a lay audience kind of taking to it, but a lay audience could take to Tarana because it's fast.
Hmm.
Yeah. But nevertheless, whenever you use nonsense syllables, there is an element of mysticism to using syllables which either imitate holy sounds or sacred sounds, which are themselves meaningless, whether it's Om or Allah. I mean, these are words which don't have any referential meaning as such. Uh, so Nom, Tom, or Alalom, these are syllables that are used in uh, Tarana, but also the imitating the plucking of the strings of the veena, sitar, um, or some of the tabla bowls, you know. Um, they incorporating all of that gestures towards a kind of mysticism, I think.
I'm also wondering whether uh, non-representational music is more amenable in its instrumental form as opposed to vocal form. So, for instance, you see uh, people like Ravi Shankar gaining traction in the West, and people, someone who listens to Ravi Shankar for the first time seems to seems to appreciate it. It's much more easier to appreciate Ravi Shankar as opposed to, say, listen to the same raga being sung. So there is certainly something about the instrument, even though the instrument is supposed to imitate the vocal. There's something about the instrument itself which makes it more amenable to listeners.
Yeah, the instrument follows a different form from, say, the khayal. So in that sense, all the work in free time is done towards the beginning, and there's no tabla accompaniment. And then once the very slow sections in free time are done, say with Ravi Shankar, like the bass strings, the lower notes, then you gradually move into a more jhala like kind of um, you know rendition. The jhala form begins to take over, and that has even if the tabla is not playing, um, there is a kind of rhythmic quality to it. Whatever. Um, and then the gut begins. Once the gut begins, it's kind of laikari and tankari, um, and tabla playing solo. I mean, these were innovations of Ravi Shankar because he liked laikari so much. He was such a great laikar himself, and so he gave also space to the tabla player to play, solos, and just became exciting even to people who didn't understand anything. I mean, how many people understand tal and exactly what's happening with tal? But there was kind of excitement there. With khayal, the problem is that the first bit is happening in free time, but the tabla is playing. The tabla is playing at a vilambit speed. So we can't even make out what the tabla is playing. At least when the tabla starts playing in with the sitar, it's na, din, din, na, na. At least it's at that speed. Here with slowed down ektal or jhumra or even uh, teen tal, uh, it's not often easy to make out with the singer, especially because the singer, when, as I said, when the sitar player starts playing as the tabla is playing, when it starts playing the gat, then the sitar player doesn't play much alap. It's not much, there isn't much free time playing in that section. He's playing, and the tabla playing both within the kind of setting of the tempo. But the khayal singer is playing to a tempo which anyway is not recognizable in any normal sense as a recognizable tempo. On top of that, they themselves are not singing to tempo, only coming back to tempo when they have to come back to the one, when they have to sing that part of the composition which comes back to the one of the cycle. Then they come back to the tempo for about 2 seconds or 3 seconds, and then again they go back into the free time. So this is an extraordinarily abstract um, form of um, music making.
Does it
It would be
does
very
it
challenging to the listener. But once you begin to understand what it is, and if you are susceptible to the tonality of the voice, then you will get kind of mesmerized by it.
does a tabla player perhaps get more freedom to explore when it's with an instrument as opposed to when it's vocal?
A kind of freedom, more freedom to play solos,
Hmm.
although there are singers who allow the tabla player in the drut section to play some solos, but they're far fewer because it purports to be a far more austere, in a sense, uh, form of extreme form of reflection, and it won't. It has traditionally been suspicious of pointless displays of virtuosity. It may or may not be right in its prejudice, but there are there is almost no tabla solo playing in Kumar Gandharva's expositions, and very little harmonium playing. It's almost like Tanpura. It's almost as if the harmonium player is only playing sa and pa. He might be playing a little bit more, and he's not even a person who always sings vilambit, iktal, or chumra or whatever. Even at Madhila, I mean, or he's not. He wants to remain focused on just what he's doing with the rag in completely non-representational terms. You know, and so there are many facets of instrumental music which would make it more easily recognizable formally um, to a lay listener than the real formal breakdown, and I use the word breakdown in a positive sense, of of Khayal and Hindustani classical music.
So the vocal performances give primacy to the vocalist, perhaps in a way that instrumental performances don't. Because often when you listen to uh, Vilayat Khan's performance with an accomplished uh, tabla player, with Ustad Zakir Hussain, for instance, you see that they're kind of equal players in the game. Or Ravi Shankar with Alara. There's this, you don't get to, say that there's a primacy of Ravi Shankar there, the
There
primacy
is
of
the primacy of Ravi Shankar, but yes,
yeah.
there are celebrity tabla players who also going to, I mean, attract the audience. The audience is also going there to listen to them in particular,
Hmm.
alongside the main performer. And this to a large extent is an idiom created by concert idiom created by Ravi Shankar. You know, he is the one who encourages tabla player to embark on these solos, which in the end turns out to be quite a canny decision because it draws the crowds. And even forms like Sawal Jawab, I mean, maybe part of his innovations or innovations at the time, and it'll always draw applause from the audience. Whether the sitar plays something, then the tabla plays something, and then the sitar plays something, Sawal Jawab, in the Sawal Jawab question and answer fashion. Um, but it's become bankrupt. I mean, these with the greatest of respect for artists like Pandit Ravi Shankar, who are great, very great performers and artists, but the idiom itself has now become bankrupt.
Why do you think that is?
Um,
It's more amenable. Like it's a good introduction to classical music.
yeah, it's a relatively easy way of drawing applause from people who don't actually understand what's going on but are excited by all the movement and activity
Yeah.
and sense that something important is happening. They're not actually keeping tal in terms of knowing what's going on with the sawal jawab allocations of time. But I would also say that I'm not prejudiced against these. I mean, we are a tiny bit prejudiced, but I'm not, hugely prejudiced against this kind of uh, populism. But it's become a cliche. Like many of the aspects of even Hindustani classical vocal music, they've become cliches. You know, Also, their original radical impulse is lost under genuflections to the idea that this is um, this is immemorial,
Hmm.
uh, and the whole ethos is tired.
Because it's often treated as a sort of museum. Classical music is treated as a sort of museum that you're supposed to preserve with the various kharanas and everything.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
the space to exploration is limited in that sense. And I was listening to uh, forgetting his name, Ustad Vilayat Khan's son.
Hmm.
It's a very stuck on his name. He's a very
Shujat
accomplished.
Khan, is that
Yes,
Shujat?
yes, Sujat Khan.
Yeah.
So I was listening to him talk with Arvind Parekh,
Ah,
who's a contemporary of Vilayat Khan, and there was a lot of tension between the approaches that they were taking because Sujat Khan again likes to experiment. He has done fusion with Persian artists and music. He sings ghazals and explores into territories that are light. And Arvind Parekh sort of wants to preserve and he talks about loyalty to your tradition. So one of the things that Sujat Khan says is, I am my own person. So, he has to sort of express himself. He has to find his own voice. and to just keep on carrying on his father's legacy and continuing what he did was be to become a cheap imitator. And no one really wants to be a cheap imitator. No artist wants to be a cheap imitator. They want to create something original of their own. That space is limiting in classical music.
Yes, it is. Because I mean, there's just the generosity of the field, despite all its rivalries and competitiveness, that allowed really a lot of people who were, in a way, outsiders come into the field. Someone like Ravi Shankar himself, for instance, Nikhil Banerjee, um, even people like Bhimsen Joshi. I mean, they they pursued these art forms while actively escaping their own milieu. It's not as if they were kind of inheritors like princes are of a crown that somebody else, their father, had before them. A lot of it was shaped by impulsive decisions on the part of artists to pursue these forms. And as I said, the forms themselves were slowed down or investigated or rethought at great risk. Um, and we have forgotten the history of these aberrations and innovations. We we are not interested really in thinking of this world as a more in terms of a more fluid form of experiment. We are eager to see them as some sort of something sacred set in stone. Um, as a milieu, also, it's closed down. There is very little discussion. There's very little intellectual content to the discussions. Nobody though knows what a rag is. I mean, people will still keep saying that it is not this, it is not that. They can tell you what Yaman Kalyan is, but they don't know why it is that. I'm not criticizing them for not knowing. I'm criticizing. I'm saying, why is it that we don't inquire into what form of knowing then a rag might be? If we cannot describe it in our usual terms of describing and identifying something, then why don't we raise this question more in the way that, say, people like in their interviews earlier on, Kishori Amonkar did, when she compared singing Hindustani classical music to a blind person, navigating their way, which refers to, again, to a form of navigation of the non-representation. If we see, then we are in the world of representations. Similarly, Praha Atre, in an interview I saw recently, and if I had known this, I mean, this interview is from September 2021, and an afternoon rag, Finding the Rag came out in, I think, in April that
Yeah.
year. If I'd known that, if the book was still being written at that time, I would have certainly included a reference to that interview, because she's saying some one or two things that I speak at length about in the book. She calls it um, an amurt music. Amurt, murt meaning form or murti, like an image or a form, and amurt meaning without form. She calls it abstract music. Um, so you see people like Praha Atre, like Kishore Amonkar, thinking about what it is they're doing. It has to be said that in some ways, in obvious ways, for Prabha Atre, she's an outsider, and she says so herself. And that's why she made her first successful recording, and she says then after that she stopped recording in a sense because she kept thinking, I need to do better, or whatever. She was an outsider. She was a great singer. Kishore Amonkar, of course, was the renowned Mogubai Kurdikar's daughter, but she too went through an entire period of exile when her voice was giving her trouble, when she was no longer in circulation. She was just doing riyaz by herself. And it is this kind of pursuit and practice and repetition and investigation outside the realm of what we now think of as the world of Indian classical music, that is performance, and what the performers call programs. और एक program करना है, परसों मैं एक program करूंगा. Outside that realm, Kumar Gand was another outsider in that sense, that he spent a lot of time, once having been a child prodigy, spending time outside of the world of classical music performance because of, because of the affliction to do with his lungs, or his health. All of this produced forms of inquiry which we are still not fully aware of, but they were obviously there, and they were reshaping the way this kind of music was happening. Even with Ustad Amir Khan, now he's listening to, eavesdropping on, or listening to Ustad Abdul Wahid Khan, who is not his guru. He's not picking up these forms of thinking from his guru, but from elsewhere. Of course, people nowadays will say, yes, I'm from this gharana, but I believe in taking what's good from every gharana. That's fine, but that's a cliche. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about an even-handedness, a kind of a equal interest in everything that's good, and that's a good quality. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the compulsions and pressures which make us take certain decisions, and which open us up to certain things at a certain point of time, which then reshape the way we think about the form, and reshape the way others think about the form as well. So any art form requires a great deal of risk taking, of thought. At any given point of time, the changes cannot only be achieved by accomplishment or the observance of what's right according to expectations of the form or the rag.
So I want to talk, because you do a little bit of comparative uh, writing on classical music with Western classical music and pop. Uh, I'm wondering whether, because one of the striking differences, what that one first encounters is the importance that narrative is given in Western classical music. Some of the greatest, my favorite piece of Western classical music is Bach's St. Matthew's Mass, which is entirely narrative driven. It's beautifully written, uh, but you see that again even in the sort of instrumental fields, even in things like Four Seasons, which are again Vivaldi's Four Seasons, which are different from let's say, the Indian ragas, which are attempting to, dance-ins ragas, and which are attempting to bring on frames and things like that. There is a difference there because Western classical music seems to me to be more driven by a narrative, uh, and much less abstract, perhaps, than Indian classical music, but with space to explore within a certain contours.
Yeah, I mean, the way we understand Western classical music now is, I mean, especially after Romanticism, and then the way the Enlightenment gives a primacy to the individual, and as it were, separates the individual from the world. We understand knowledge, writing, language, and art forms to be about something, and to sort of also um, to be central to the human narrative in some way, to re-emphasize the centrality of the human being in some way, um, which is why we can speak of um, music in terms of human emotions, beginning with happy and sad. A piece of music in Western music might be deemed a happy song or a sad song.
Mm.
And even, as I say in Finding the Rag, the major scale without any flats or sharps uh, is uh, is a happy scale. Any scale, any minor scale, any scale with sharps and flats in it uh, is a is a sad scale, or is a, depending on how many sharps and flats are clustered together, it could even be it could even be a disquieting scale. Um, I mean, those dichotomies don't really apply to uh, the Hindustani classical rag, in that it's not as if a rag like Shri, which has clusters of flats and sharps right next to each other, um, chromatic notes separated only by semitone, um, is not less tranquil than any other rag. You know, in fact, it is a deeply tranquil rag. But given the sort of mimetic and human-centered narrative, where everything sort of tells us a story about human emotions and human being of Western music, um, those kind of slightly discordant sounding clusters of notes in a Western piece of music will sound anxious and not tranquil. Um, so, in fact, tranquility as being an important, as it being an all-important facet of art is a preoccupation of Indian aesthetics, and it only sort of comes to the West. Firstly, in the late 18th century, with Kant talking about disinterestedness in art, that is, art is not connected to desire in the ordinary sense. It is disinterested in its savoring of beauty. Um, and then later on to a critic like Matthew Arnold, who also feels criticism's interest is an interested is an interest in a disinterested partaking of the work, by which he doesn't mean impartial um, or objective, which is the usual sort of way post-enlightenment thinking understands the word disinterested, but as being both engaged and detached. And he gets this idea from the Gita of an engaged form of action, which is also disengaged, which is a very contradictory way of thinking about action, but begins to make sense when you think of it in terms of the aesthetic and in terms of how we experience beauty as a form of engagement, which is also not engaged in any normal sense. Um, and then gradually it makes its way towards modernism, this idea of what Abhinava Gupta called, where he added it to the rasas, the shantras, shant, shanti, tranquility, equipoise, something which is in it, which is deeply in the artwork, deeply involved in life, and yet not involved in any sense in which we think of involvement. It is delighting, but it is also distant and therefore unmoved. And so people like Eliot are beginning to talk about this in their criticism. Significant emotion, his formulation, is almost a translation of rasa. The significant emotion is a reminder that emotion lies in the poem and not in the poet. Don't look for it in the poet. Don't think the poem is an expression of the poet's emotion. The emotion lies in the poem. And this, as I say in Finding the Rag, is also true of the way we understand notes in a rag or in Hindustani classical music. The emotion is not something imparted to it by the singer. The emotion comes from the singer receding into the background and allowing the note center stage. The emotion lies in the note. It just needs to be given center stage. For that, the singer must recede. So these ideas of tranquility are at odds with ideas that works of art need to embody and emotions and behave like the human beings who created those works of art. That they should be angry or sad or happy in the same way as human beings are, the human beings who wrote that poem or epic. There is a critique of that idea in this being introduced by this idea of the composure of creation.
One genre of music which fits that description, but also happens to be Western. And I've always wondered about this because I listened to your album, This Is Not Fusion. I loved it, and particularly the Ilela, Def to Todi, and I loved Summertime. Those were my favorite tracks from the album. Uh, but the presence of jazz in it, because I've always found jazz to be uh, not all jazz, of course, certain forms of jazz, certain compositions to be uh, quite non-representational. I was quite irritated when I made a friend of mine listen to John Coltrane's Giant Steps, and his reaction to it was that it's a jolly song, it's a happy song, which is not true. I mean, there are happy jazz songs, maybe Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald, perhaps some of their works. But Giant Steps is not a happy song. It's non-representational. And what Coltrane is trying to do there is very similar to what Indian classical musicians are trying to do. He's trying to uh, connect the dots. He's trying to explore a field which is not very obvious at first listen. And he does it again with my favorite things, which he takes a very familiar tune and then he plays around with it and creates something that is uh, that's not the tune that's memorable and catchy and easily recognizable or anything like that. And that aspect of it is very similar to what Indian classical musicians do.
Yeah, I mean, jazz begins as a form of, not begins, but comes into its own with people like Miles Davis and Charlie Parker and John Coltrane as a form of non-representational thinking about music, you know, and they want to be resistant to representation, whether it's representation to song or even representing their race, you know, they are anomalous. They don't want to fall into the just to the simple kind of category of black musicians or African American musicians. The these norms are so pervasive, just as the norms of understanding music mimetically are pervasive, that we will kind of insist on listening to things mimetically, even when they are abstract, especially with when the context is Western, European. It directs us always into some sort of mimetic interpretation. So if you listen to uh, John Coltrane's free improvisation, we will think, oh, yeah, he was going through a breakdown at that time. Uh, you know, he had problems with drugs. It would lead to his death, and this is what this music is about. So it's very difficult to understand the purity of this pursuit of liberation in his case, because tonality itself has so much baggage, mimetic baggage in Western music. The liberation from tonality. Indian music doesn't have Indian music. Sur doesn't have that mimetic baggage. It is self-standing. It does not represent happiness or sadness. So the musician doesn't need to be free of sur. The musician needs to move towards sur from themselves. But in Western music, sur, or the note, the sequence of notes of tonality, that is notes in tune, have to be either happy, sad, or anxious, or terrifying, or whatever. And so it is an imperative for, or became an imperative for certain musicians, that is, composers and performers at a certain point of time, to escape the mimetic baggage of tonality. And that's why they embarked on free jazz, on free improvisation, such as you see a little bit of, quite a bit of, in my favorite things, for instance. It edges towards that, especially in some of the performances. It's liberating. Um, and funny as well, since he's doing it to something like my favorite things. But the kind of mimetic interpretation will be that he's one mimetic interpretation could be he's taking a nice light, uh, you know, pleasant song and making it darker. But of course, I think there are enough people who understand that he's just turning it into something unrecognizable, which is what is happening with Khayal and song as well, in a much more mm, theoretically thought out way. The forms are there, and the rag itself is a way of thinking about progression, which allows that kind of expansion to happen, a kind of non-progressing progression. That is what the rag is. That is it. It goes up, it comes down, goes up, certain notes are omitted, certain notes are sung. That whole sort of way of approaching a progression itself can then leads to um, these kind of more extremely experimental ways of thinking about what a progression might be that Khayal represents.
I think one of the reasons for the mimetic representation is perhaps it provides a sort of completeness, and it's the tendency of human beings to find completeness everywhere, and
Mhm.
that is absent when you don't have a mimetic interpretation.
Mm.
That is precisely what Coltrane is fighting against
Mm.
in explicitly in Giant Steps.
Mm. No, I agree. Yeah.
So the other thing that you mentioned towards the end of the book, and we reached towards the end of the conversation, is cinema, which is the influence of Indian classical music on cinema. And there hasn't been much because Indian cinema, uh, Bollywood primarily, seems to be derived more from the Natya Sastra, which is to say that it has to retain all the essential rasas, and that is present in almost most popular rendition of Indian movies. Uh, the Indian classical music sort of rebels against that. Yeah, in particular. One exception, though, that I find is Kumar Sahani. I don't I don't know what you think of this, but do let me know the Kumar Sahani's interpretation of classical or the influence of Indian classical music on the narrative and the lyricism in Kumar Sahani's movies. But the obvious one is, of course, Satyajit Ray, which is that there is a sort of meandering quality in his movies, which you mentioned, and which Satyajit Ray also explicitly writes about. And he argues that it comes from Vibhuti Bhusan's work, upon which his first three movies are based upon. But it's also present in his other movies, as you move on towards movies like The Music Room, Jal Sagar. So, uh, he seems to be one of those rare Indian directors who are acutely aware of uh, Indian classical music and are influenced by it uh, in and use it in their narrative.
Satyajit Ray, I mean, um, he's one of those, rare artists, individuals who are also practitioners, uh, who find themselves in the realm of music in the time of modernity, aware that they are at the crossroads of at least two, if not more, traditions. I mean, the Indian way of understanding music, that 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 a form of thought like the rag represents, and on the other hand, the all the stuff that he loved in Western classical music, um, comprising, you know, symphonies, sonatas, all those composers, and he's very acute about you know as I quote him in the book, I mean, about how difficult it is to use Hindustani classical music as background score because of its rejection of narrative qualities. A raga is a raga, he says. That is, a raga is not about something, even though it might have a name like Basant, it's not really about Basant. It is sung during Basant. It's not about Basant in the same way that the Pastoral Symphony of Beethoven's is purports to be about the countryside and the landscape, and and demonstrates what a musical narrative about the countryside and nature and landscape might sound like. How spring and the storm, a storm, might be portrayed through music. Beethoven's music demonstrates that, even while, as I was listening to today with some students, undercutting it with his private melancholy, which is what Western musicians must do often, that act within a narrative framework or mimetic framework, but undercut that framework through their sense of melancholy. Um, but so he's somebody who's aware, like Tagore was, of what these traditions imply and what our situatedness in them implies. Um, he's also the one filmmaker who is extraordinarily alert to sound. So his soundtracks are, music is only one part of the uniqueness of his soundtracks. I think the most unique part of his soundtracks have to do with um, the sounds that form other stories which are not part of the story that is unfolding. A boatman, some muezzin or somebody shouting in the distance, something that distracts us momentarily from the main story, and that decentering, that the distraction constitutes is a great contribution of his, uh, through the form of cinema, which we identify only with the visual and with the story that's happening in front of us, and do not think necessarily of something that opens out into worlds which are not in the story that's contained in the visuals. But his soundtrack is always opening us out into a world that is not being filmed. Um, so in that sense, he's critiquing this integrity, the humanist integrity of the self on many levels. So he's a very interesting filmmaker in that way. Um, the other person, of course, to return to the word meandering, but in his case, it's not meandering, but near stillness in some of his films, is Mani Kaul, who is also very invested in Hindustani classical music, especially Drupad. Um, I haven't seen the Kumar Shani. I haven't seen that
Mm.
much of Kumar Shani's work, but I'm interested now that you mentioned this.
I think the clearest exposition of it is in Bhavantaram, which is his uh, biography of Keluchar and Mahapatra,
Ah,
the Odissi dance.
must watch that. Yeah.
So, do you see that like in the influence of Indian music in any popular uh, movies, for instance, other Indian like continuing to today? Do you see that anywhere?
Today,
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. I do find some of the Hindi movies, about gangs and stuff interesting. But I don't think they are. I think they have a subterranean interest in the meditative, in spite of their strong narrative and even gory elements. Uh,
Mm.
but 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 overtly non-narrative cinema compared to other cultures, I mean, I think we find less of it in India for some reason. Um, we probably find more of it in China, or that kind of experimental cinema, but
Maybe
less.
Tarkovsky.
And Tarkovsky, of course, but in India we don't find that much of it. Um, uh, just and Money Call comes closest, because some of his shots are just stills. You know, um, yeah, he's the greatest of that particular line, but we don't find a great deal of it. I mean, completely radical non-narrative cinema, where, as with Kiarostami, even, there seems to be some narrative, but
Hmm.
the whole kind of uh, sections of the film where it's just as if the camera is recording stuff, and then it just is amazing what it records inadvertently, you know.
Wong Kar-wai, I think, is the most prominent example of that, of
Mm.
distraction. So I want to end this by asking you about classism, uh, because there is an element of that among classical singers who seem to be very derisive of not just popular music but also semi-classical forms like qawwalis or ghazals or maybe the rendition of a raga in a song, popular song, things like that. And do you think there is, like, this is because, like, this could be due to what Adorno and Horkheimer would call repetition, which was, I think his criticism of jazz was ridiculous, but
Was what?
his
Sorry.
Adorno's criticism of jazz, he seemed to hate jazz, call it repetitious. But I think there is an element of, perhaps a sort of criticism directed towards these semi-classical or pop forms is because of the culture industry or reputation. But a lot of it also has to do with simple classism, believing that you are performing a superior art form and that these art forms are inferior and shouldn't be given the same status as yours.
Yeah, when that happens, then you stop sort of doing interesting things, because as a thinker, composer, artist, because I mean, obviously the rags themselves over the centuries were just simple tunes which have been, through investigation, turned into something profound. I mean, God Sarang, or Gujri Todi. I mean, these are some of them are pentatonics, only 5 notes. Bhupali, the which is supposed to be a grand foundational rag, is identical to the sort of folk scales sung in the Pahadi regions, in the hilly mountainous regions. So the philosopher musicians were taking everything, especially the very trivial kind of things that they heard and which were in circulation and which they found interesting, and then subjecting them to investigation, slowing them down. The rag is a way of doing that. It's a way of finding a profound relationships in those 5 notes of Bhupali that cannot be discovered only by singing those notes as a folk song. But that doesn't mean you don't bring that in. Those are the things you bring into your domain. You don't shut it out. Um, any kind of shift happens through, and then this is true right up to our day. I mean, people like Tagore, they're collecting songs in their families and putting them to new use. The Hindi film directors of the music directors of the 50s and 60s are extraordinary in what they incorporate and what they do with these elements that they're incorporating, whether it's Indian folk music, rag, swing music, um, bebop, or whatever, you know. So it's the auditory world around us and what we most enjoy in it, that we reshape and bring into new forms, whether those forms are popular forms. If they're to be truly interesting, they must have a multiplicity of provenance and inquiry. Otherwise, they just become static pop songs. You know, the quality of being static applies to anything, pop song or Hindustani classical music, whatever. If you shut things down and you produce only perfected utopian versions of a particular form, then you are not letting things in. You're not using your form to let things in which are not supposed to, but which actually you find interesting. Herbie Hancock, for instance, when he starts doing jazz fusion. So you were saying, I was shutting all of that out. I used to enjoy Sly and the Family Stone, but we didn't believe in openly acknowledging that kind of music. But then he decided that he would begin incorporating some of those things which he enjoyed, but otherwise didn't acknowledge as a musician, into his music. And that's how, you know, he came up with albums like Headhunters, and that's how it happens. It's you whether it's a jazz, pop song, a cartoon, a profound piece of writing, or Hindustani classical music, you pick up everything that you want to pick up and investigate it through that form that you have chosen. Whether you're a cartoonist or a pop singer, member of some band, uh, a songwriter like Paul Simon in Graceland, or a Hindustani classical thinker who, in in the history of Hindustani classical music, brought into existence things like Gujri Todi, God Sarang, Miyaki Tori. All these things are melodies being picked up and modulated in subtle ways, and their profound possibilities being opened up. But what are those things that are being opened up? They are all minor, small things in the culture.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. And I think that I hope that the bohemian quality returns to Indian classical music, because that is the only way to keep it popular. Once an art form closes itself, the best art forms are made, of course, by opening themselves up to other influences. The Doors uh, fused jazz uh, with abstract poetry and rock music. Uh, so I hope that spirit returns to Indian classical music. Professor Chaudhry, I had a great time talking to you, and I enjoyed it a lot, learned a lot. Uh, did you enjoy the conversation?
Very much. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Absolutely. You obviously, I mean, these things are of some importance to you, which is good. I'm so glad.
All right. So have a great day, and subscribe to the channel, like the video, comment, share. All right. See you again.
Bye bye.